You're listening to Conversations with Chanda, a Minneapolis Foundation podcast that unpacks the community's grittiest, most vexing problems, hosted by Chanda Smith-Baker. In this episode, Chanda sits down with community builder, trailblazer, and social justice expert, Thao-Urabe. Enjoy the show.
I'm so happy to have you on the podcast, and I've been thinking a lot about having a conversation over the last couple of years with you, and then saw a recent announcement and thought now feels like the right time.
Thank you. Well, I have been following you and just listening to the podcast, and you've done such a terrific job of just having guests who help us think deeply and share very tangible examples of what to do. And so it's my honor to be asked to join you.
Thank you. So you recently announced that you're leaving CAL.
Right.
And for those that are listening that don't know what CAL stands for, will you?
Sure. It's the Coalition of Asian American Leaders. And so it's a social justice network of Asian American leaders in the state of Minnesota who focuses on building up social justice leaders, both high school students all the way to career leaders, as well as really working on priority issues that matter to the community, both from the angle of research, community building, and policy issues. And so we spend quite a bit of time doing both community building and engagement to really looking at research and data and collecting community stories of impact to then drive how we shape policy agendas at the systemic level.
And you were the founder.
Right.
And there's a lot in there for me that was triggered in that announcement. Like, oh my God, what's going to happen? To, wow, someone who founded it, what was that decision-making process? To thinking about sort of this great resignation time and how people are recalibrating. Mm-hmm. And so I would just love to hear a little bit about your journey with CAL and, maybe what led you to found that organization to where you're at now.
Right. Thanks for asking. I think sometimes we're so busy in the work of addressing just what is happening, and we forget to really think about the purpose of organizations, right? Like they serve really important roles and they do really important things for both the community and to help push us along and systems and things like that. So I just feel really fortunate that I happen to have had a lot of relationships and experiences that brought me to CAL. And I was lucky to be at those initial tables of conversations with different Asian American leaders here in Minnesota who were grappling with what it meant to be both Asian Americans in this state of Minnesota and how we wanted to show up, right? And I think that's really how the conversation started. And so I've had a long career and have been a community builder and advocate on lots of different community issues. And so was just part of those conversations when we were talking about just in that moment of what it meant to be who we are in the context of being in Minnesota. The idea really came to be about convening more spaces so that Asian American leaders could come together, both leaders in different sectors, generations, and across different ethnic groups in the community. And so that's really what prompted the conversations around CAL. So I happened to be at a point in my life where I was working at a job where I was traveling quite often to San Francisco and had just had a daughter not too long ago. And so felt like, I really need to be grounded in this place that I live. Just agreed to help facilitate many of those conversations. So I think right away I facilitated many, many small fireside kind of chat conversations with different leaders and just heard overwhelmingly that people wanted the space, both to talk about who they are, but to not just limit it to their own experience, but to really find space where their leadership is supported and where they would have opportunities to really shape the future for this state, for their communities, and work on the issues that matter to them. And that's really what created CAL. I am fortunate that I, have had lots of experiences in nonprofits, in leadership building, and in philanthropy, and sort of all of that came together. And when I first spoke about it with different funders, and maybe this is part of the story that you know too, Chanda, which is being a woman and a woman of color. And it doesn't matter how much experience you've had, whenever you're proposing a new idea, people are like, well, where's the proof that works, right? And so there were not a lot of enthusiastic, ready investors, I would say, in saying, oh, you all want to birth this new thing, like what is it, how will we know it works? And so I think when you think about community benefit organizations and being in particular a woman of color, people are not investing in your ideas. They want proof that something is going to work. And so I literally had to be like, okay, well, I'm still going to do this. And then I will come back to you when the idea is more solid. And I hope that you will stay open and that you'll support it. And so eventually, when we were able to demonstrate that lots of people wanted this to happen and that we had agendas, we were able to get small seed funds. And I want to give a shout out to Gary Cunningham, because he was at the Northwest Area Foundation. And I remember very specifically talking to Gary, and he shared his own story, but he also shared what the African American community was going through and their own, contemplations about leadership and how you come together and all of those things. And Gary was one of the very first person who said, you don't have to know, but if you want to do this, I will support you. So I can't thank him enough for leveraging his role and his resources that he had privileged to be in charge of at that time, to be like, I'll support you. And that small seed fund allowed for us to at least pay for food so people could come together, rent space and all of those things. And that's really the beginnings of CAL.
There's a couple of things just in terms of those believers and those folks that are willing to take a chance on you. And my story was when I was at Pillsbury United Communities, the Kresge Foundation gave a big grant to Pillsbury United Communities that was sort of a general operating grant to sort of seed innovation and creativity at scale across the organization, and an idea and a strategy that I had. Right. And we sort of partnered in the evolution of what it was to look like. Right. But it was because of that actually helped seed North Market and North News, and where I say Pillsbury is sort of the genesis of where their work sort of took off from, right? The next chapter of its work was because someone believed in the vision that wasn't fully laid out. There wasn't a work plan. Right. There wasn't this 3-year thing with deliverables, but there was a very clear mapping and vision. And I remember telling them, I'm really sure that some of my best ideas never made it to the desk. And I was so uninspired at some point by that. And I just wanted, because we're talking to folks that are in the space, both that we have been in where we've been discouraged. And there were times where I was just just forget it and walked away. And then there were times like what you just described, where you're like, I'm really going to be dogmatic about this and just continue to push through. And I know this is it.
Right.
So, perhaps just speaking on the importance of just sticking with what you are envisioned with, and the importance of those champions that are willing to take the risk with you.
Yes. I mean, it's so important, right? Because one is just to have that kind of belief means that what I often say about this sector is that it's a sector that is working on really difficult things and trying to reimagine a future that none of us have ever lived in before. So you can't expect proof, and you have to support vision. And I think part of it is to really allow for people to test those ideas out. And I just think that there are a lot of different complications when you are a leader of color that perhaps you don't both have relationships, or you don't have, the resources yourself, or all of those things. So I felt really confident about the idea of Cal just because I had spent so much time with leaders in our communities, right? And everything I was saying was people wanted this to happen, and that I felt personally ready. And I knew that if I could keep going, that it was going to become something. So one is just your own personal beliefs about what you know about your community, right? Knowing, your own abilities, but also when you listen to community, you just know when something is ripe, right? When an idea is ripe. And then part of it is to know that, you need supporters, you need resources, and all of those things. And so that both self-belief, because sometimes the people who have the resources look at you and be like, that's never been done before, right? I've had so many of those experiences throughout my life. And so I've really learned to really listen to my own intuition about things, and then to keep an idea, even if the time is not right, to sort of keep it in my head, because there will be opportunities. And I feel really fortunate for Cal. Once we got some support, we were proceeding whether we had support or not. But once we got support, and we spent it on supporting people to come together, and then eventually spent time building those relationships, so that by the time we launched the work, we had a really strong base of people who were supportive of our agendas. When we came out of the gate, so to say, people couldn't believe that, for example, we could win at the legislature, because they were like, where did you come from? Right. And I said, well, we spent time with our folks, and we trained them, and we worked with them, and they're ready to do this. And so, after 10 years of that, I think that I've just learned so much about making sure that leadership is not just embodied in me, but that I also believe it in our communities. And so that's kind of what led to this transition, because from the very beginning, Chanda, I had always said the idea of Cal is never going to work if it's synonymous with me, right? Like if I'm Cal and we are a network of leaders, and so we have to believe in that, and that I would be committed to building a strong organization, but that there would come a point where it made sense for me to transition. And it just happened to be this period of, as you said, the great resignation in the field, but also we are the strongest we've ever been. I think our work has proven itself, and we have a really strong network. And so I felt like, you know what, this is how I would have wanted to transition into any other organizations that I had been executive director of before. Also, oftentimes my own experience is that as communities of color, immigrant, refugee communities, oftentimes when there's big leadership changes, that's really the time where a lot of people question the organization. And I wanted folks to know this is actually the strongest we've ever been, right? And it is good for another leader to come. And I and you, like, we could be anywhere and we would still be doing right. All the things that matter to us in our communities, and that there is space for us somewhere else, right? So a lot of different thoughts went into it, but I really felt like it was the right time.
Yeah. I recently talked to Rapa from Nexus Community, and he talked about more of having a vocation versus a career. And you just sort of mentioned it, right? Like no matter where we go, mm-hmm. right? It's, our work is so much beyond sort of the place in which we're employed, like how we show up in community, the expectation that we have, how we lead on the boards that we sit in, sort of our commitment beyond ourselves to give back to our community. And I think that this is true for a lot of people working in this space, particularly people of color. Do you see this as a consistent sort of theme? Do you think it's a different sort of demand on leaders of color?
I mean, all I know is that when I walk into a room, I can't determine how individuals in that room will see me, right? And sometimes they relegate me to being an Asian person, a woman, being a certain age, or whatever the case. And so I think I try to really listen for what the questions are, because then that helps me to understand, like, what is the situation in this room, right? And then oftentimes I do think that, unfortunately, for leaders of color, we don't determine that. And oftentimes we're not seen as our own individual leaders. And so when we walk into a space, people have predetermined how they want us to be showing up in that space. It's from the ridiculousness of someone sitting next to me and saying, I think Asian babies are so cute. And so you're just like, really? You're trying to, like, we're on this board together. I didn't get here because, and I don't, I don't need you to make me feel comfortable about being Asian, right? Right. And you don't need to convince me that you're comfortable with an Asian person next to you, but it tells me a lot about that person, right? And how they perceive me. Or whenever we talk about certain things, people will, will look at you and they're expecting you to say something because they're talking about, either any of their perceived identities of you. And that's how I know that in that room, they must think I represent everybody from that group of people. And so I try to really pause and say, this is my experience, but like, I can't speak even for all Hmong women, right? Or for immigrants and refugees. I can tell you what I have heard, I can tell you what data says, and I can tell you what our agenda is around particular things. But that takes a lot of leadership skills to be able to get to that point. And so I try not to start from the place of being offended because somebody is ignorant, but just being mindful that what people say to me exposes their own lack of both knowledge or exposure or any of those things, right? But it is hard. I mean, there are some days where you're just like, racial equity is not something that just matters to me. It should matter to this whole organization, right? But how come when we have a conversation, everyone pauses until I say something, and I've been on the board of an organization where that was truly the case. And I really had to tell the board chair and the executive director, I do not want to be coming into that board meeting where we're talking about an organizational issue around racial equity. And everyone thinks that they can't say anything until I speak, right? Or until I bring it up. And I think that's really, that is often the burden that we carry. And so there's a heaviness that we have to, I guess, bear, but also just being conscious about what are the right steps to take when you personally experience it, because it's not just a mistake. It really does emotionally sometimes trigger you, right?
Yeah. So governance is an interesting one. And I know we have some shared perspectives on this from previous conversations. And we both have sat on a number of boards, and we've seen a transition at the governance level of boards that want to become more inclusive, more diverse, and more aware of what's happening around issues of race in our community. And so they're taking training and efforts to do so. Mm-hmm. Have you experienced anyone doing it right? Or could you share examples of what? That was sort of a trick question.
I was like, ooh. Let me think about that. Well, I'd love to hear your perspective too, Chanda, about given your own experience, what you see working well, right? But I think it's that space of being able to understand that ultimately when you're on a board, or if your reason for coming together is the organization, right, that that needs to be kept as priority, because otherwise it's very easy to go on a personal journey of enlightenment, and that takes a lifetime, right? So there is only so much training that you can do with individuals to I guess get them to that point. And so I have to say, I don't know what the right process or steps are for any one organization, but I do think that it's really important that organizations, by by way of creating opportunities for individuals to be in service to that organization, that be kept as the priority when you're choosing tactics for discussing how you support individuals starting wherever they're starting in their journey, to then being able to get that group of people to work together to make decisions in the interest of the organization and things like that. And I think that what I see often is that people pick one or the other, right? Like it's almost like, well, we're starting wherever we're starting as individuals. So we're going to support individual enlightenment and create opportunities for people to talk about what they want to or need to and be educated. And I think, that's well and fine. But how does that impact the decisions that you have to make as an organization? And how will you measure yourselves in terms of how you're able to actually then decide together something that benefits the organization and the communities that you're intending to be in service to? So I think, there's room to grow there. And I think it's just a constant process of both growth that, yes, involves a lot of individuals, but also when we lose sight that it's organizational and then we only go to the personal place, I have seen often that it's hard to come back to the organizational place because everybody then starts to say, well, this is where I'm at. I'm not ready for that, right? or, I don't have exposure to that. So how will I get it? And then you spend a lot of time on the individual journeys that oftentimes hinders organizational decisions.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I don't have a good solution, but I'd love to hear your experience about what you think works.
I guess I would say basically the same thing, that I've been on boards that are intentional about how they engage and how they talk about their work in an inclusive way. So it's embedded in how they do their work.
Right.
And they challenge your thinking in an intentional way that it creates, right, sort of this path towards a more just way or a more inclusive way or a more diverse way of doing their work. And I find that to be the most attractive for how I'd like to be at the table. I think the individual road, I sit at that table a lot where everyone wants to go on this individual journey. And, sometimes I will say it and, people will hear it now, is that, I'm always questioning. So what does this mean for the diverse folks that you've brought on the board or the people that are living this every day in their work? So you are creating a plan that actually isn't inclusive for the people that actually live this in their lives. Like this is their experience.
Right.
Or you're bringing in people from the outside to enlighten a group on an issue where they haven't even built relationships or invited the people of color to their homes, to their events, to their gatherings. So you're not even building the relationships with the people that you're sitting across from, but you want to learn about the issue in some sort of disconnected way from the relationships that you could be building. So it just doesn't feel like it gets to the crux of what I think is trying to be accomplished.
Right.
And then I guess lastly, when you build it into the work and people understand how it applies to the work so that they can be a better champion to the organization for which they're serving and volunteering for, I think it allows it to be applied in a way that hopefully allows for that same learning to happen. So what I can appreciate though, Bo, is that at least the conversation appears to be happening more.
Yes.
Although it feels like it's some blast from the past when,
Yes.
what was it? The People's Institute and all that stuff was
Right.
sort of a big deal. And it feels like we've come a bit full circle. Maybe that's my age, but
yes. Yeah, I just recognizing, like I think as you said, that the conversation is happening and that people want to do something about it, right, is a good thing. And then, I think like challenging ourselves about the the ways in which we think about how things should happen in an organization. Because of course, like when you join a board or a staff, you're being hired because of both like the expertise and the experiences that you have. And that is always important. But I think just realizing that in the social or independent sector, much of the work that we are doing is fixing what is broken in systems. And that means that we can't accept that our expertise is what's going to solve the problem, right? So how do you remain open to that? And that takes you to that place that feels uncomfortable because, you know, if you're a financial expert, you know how to do financial models, you know how to make money perhaps, right? And you think that, and that is valuable experience. But when you are coming, you know, to work in a nonprofit or in philanthropy or, you know, on the board, any of those positions, I think you really have to push yourself to be like, okay, this is valuable skills that help the business of this organization, but how does it work when a lot of the things that we're trying to address are about broken systems, right? Or things that haven't worked. And that's why we have situations we have. And so I think that's what makes people uncomfortable because we tend to, I think we tend to rely on expertise instead of really questioning whether both what that expertise, if deployed, reinforces, right, in terms of organizations and what we do. And, you know, and so that means all of us have to be able to kind of push that or be open to recognizing that we're valued for our expertise and our experience. But when we come together and try to figure out like what's the best way forward, there has to be openness, and we actually have to figure out what is uncomfortable versus just saying, if you could just learn about this community, somehow magically you're going to make the right decision. And then because you have expertise on something, somehow if you deploy that tactic or strategy, it's going to be the thing that fixes the problem, because it most likely won't be, right?
I guess I'll go to data next because you're sort of talking about sort of how people connect sort of their learning and outcome. We've talked a lot about, you know, communicating impact in our community, making a difference. Difference making is defined in all kinds of ways. And who gets to determine it and how we even disaggregate data here is quite interesting. And who's even included in the demographic information is also quite fascinating here in Minnesota. You know, I've listened to you give sort of the data stories and analysis. And from I guess, the culture of impact in our city, do you think we have a way to go in terms of determining what's working and what's not working? Like, what do you think needs to shift in how we're looking at that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, data or the side of, I guess, what's considered science is important because it sort of creates this blueprint that then other people can try to implement, right? And so from that perspective, data is important, right? But data should not, I think, be in the place of determining what is important to communities. And it in itself should not be what determines impact, right? And so I think just thinking about that means that we often rely on data to tell us what the problem is and to tell us what the solution is. And we forget that actually the process is really important, both for the determination of what to capture and then also the process of meaning making to then say what actually does impact mean for those who are most impacted. And I think that's the challenge that, you know, in particular, I see having worked in a community that both is where data doesn't represent really anyone because it's so aggregated, right, in a particular way. And then it's used by decision makers in all kinds of spaces to determine what the issues are, what investments are worthy, and then how impact is discussed. And then when you turn to the community, you recognize that there's so much that is not in data, right? That is really about people's stories and what they define as important and things like that. So data can't just be number crunching or that kind of way, and that stories do matter as well, and that stories have always been the first form of disaggregated data, right, is what I say. And so how do we make sure that that is a part of our own processes, in particular for communities where complexity and nuance really matters for outcomes, right? And so I think there's a lot to learn, because it is in particular probably in cultures that are really about relationships and about passing of knowledge in a way that is beyond just writing or those types of things, where we learn a lot about how data is seen differently, right? So like at Cal, we published a report recently, Chanda, on wealth and how wealth is defined, right? Because we have all these indicators around housing, jobs, education, all of these things that are indicators to help us figure out whether a community is wealthy, right, financially. But when we spoke to the community, actually what they talked about is wealth defined by relationships, the connections between elders and children, the ability to pass down heritage language, right? Those things that matter for how a family and a community is doing beyond finance, right? And that money is a vehicle for relationships and for well-being, but using money alone to determine wealth drives us in a whole completely different direction, right? So it was very, even though intuitively I knew that, because that's similar to the culture that I grew up in and how we caretake for each other and all of those things. But to actually then have gone through a process that validates these experiences and turns it into a study means that now other people can use it to say, okay, here's a different way to look at wealth, right? And so then what are the tools that we are providing, and what are the policies that we have created to actually facilitate this kind of wealth building that is different than just financial literacy or home buying or increasing wages and those types of things alone, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know at one point sort of social cohesion, social network, social capital were really important elements of community, or they are, but in terms of being captured, particularly with our young people, with our communities, saying that how you're connected actually matters for your future success. Like, we know that happens in communities of means,
right?
But in communities that are sort of mobile, we don't see them as just as critical. We don't make those types of investments in how they build community. We're more trying to get them programmed into their next opportunity versus connected into their next opportunity.
Right. Yes. And it then drives how we design different things, right? We often talk about, for example, funder-driven initiatives that say if you could train a person and they could increase their income, somehow the measurement of that person alone and their ability to increase income means that they have moved from, being in poverty to middle class. And what we heard back was, well, but you don't know how many people this person is taking care of, right? And if they come from a place where they're responsible for their parents, their children, and their siblings, even a six-figure, they are still having a difficult time, right? So how do we look at that whole family and not just necessarily the one training, but how do you address the context of that person as well? I think there's more to think about, but ultimately, what I kind of take away from this work is that there is a lot of community caretaking that is happening that we often don't recognize and that we often don't incentivize. And by default of money being the only measure, that sometimes we actually have become punitive to how communities take care of each other, right? So
speaking of communities taking care of each other, it's been a hard couple of years.
Yes.
And we have seen anti-Asian hate and violence be more visible
Mhm.
than what I've seen.
Right.
I certainly have learned more than I knew as a result of it in terms of the biases, the discrimination, the violence, sort of the pain within the Asian community, that I actually felt like, wow, have I been so focused
Mm.
in my own community that I was not, able to sort of see, people around me also suffering. And I know we talked briefly after the incident in Atlanta. Have those visible incidents is it creating more safety because now people are more aware, so they're now seeing it more and it's subsiding, or is it still on the rise? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's different responses for that, right? So one is just the visibility that I think in the context of COVID and, at the very highest level of our government being using language that stigmatized a whole community, that then sort of created, I guess, a sense of permission to act out in violence towards a community, because everybody is living through a very difficult time and a pandemic that is experienced by everyone, right? So I think in that context, the community has felt an increase in incidents. Certainly at Cal, we had never had that many calls from people talking about, a fear, just like that sense of like, well, I knew that people were discriminating before, but I never had this personal fear that if I went to the store, someone was going to actually call me out or not serve me or, push me, purposely bump me, or those types of things, right? So I think.
And these are residents of our state that are
Yes,
suffering in this
yes.
level of fear
Mm-hmm.
from their fellow neighbors.
That's right. And so I think when you have that kind of leadership that gives permission, and people can say whatever they want, but when you have the president of the US saying, this is caused by China, what people don't get is that the reason why it's systemic is that when we say something happens in, between Russia and the US, white people don't get the same reactions, right? But anytime we name China, Asian Americans experience the output of that in discriminatory kinds of ways, right? And so that's important to recognize that stems from the very same system of racism that judges every other community who is of color, right? So that's why it's important to really, for our own communities, to understand that we are not exempt from racism, right? We might have been used at this in systemically convenient ways to be able to talk about how communities of color are doing. But when it comes to acts of violence against people of color, we are not exempt, right? And that people can point to interpersonal violence in this moment and say, oh, it's just those bad people. But systematically, our kids are not being educated about the diversity of our communities. They don't get histories that reflect them and then reflect their peers. And so we are growing in systems that intentionally invest or divest from, truth in history, right? And truth in this history, in this country's history. So I would say that, I think overall the community still feels and is still experiencing those types of violent acts that are in the forms of both a lot of racist derogatory terminology, but also real physical fear. And unfortunately, Asian women and Asian elders have tended to have bore the brunt of the most violent acts, right? Ending in deaths and those types of things. So we have a lot of work to do. And I also want to say to my Asian American brothers and sisters and families that that's why it is really important for us to work on anti-racism systematically, because these are not just interpersonal acts of violence against individuals. It is really embedded in so much of our systems. And we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we are part of the solutions for ending racism in all kinds of systems, right? Because we stand to benefit as well. So
Yeah, and I know after, George Floyd,
mhm.
there was a lot of conversations and groups really cross-cultural understanding and unity and coming together and sort of an infinity and an understanding. Because a lot of times we get grouped, right? We're BIPOCs, we're communities of color, we're like all these things,
I know.
and I think there's these assumptions that because we're BIPOCs that we like understand everyone's issues and we're automatically aligned.
Yes.
We're automatically on the same page, and I think that's unfortunate. I have my own feel about the BIPOC language. I've shared this before, but and I understand it for grouping and data purposes, I suppose. But I know you came out and talked about anti-Blackness and the importance for the Asian communities to be part of that and vice versa. Why was that important? Why do you think it's important for us to do that work?
I've had to spend a lot of my own time learning about the history of this country because what I was taught was actually not sufficient, right? And so in that personal learning, I really came to understand that like this country is really built on slavery, right? And Asian Americans did come and were in essence, very, very low wage workers. But I think the ways in which we have benefited from Black labor, building the foundations for this country to thrive, I think that's really important. And I think that, learning about the history of how we've gotten the civil rights that we've gotten now and things like that. And it's not complete, but really it's been the leadership of Black leaders and communities who continued to believe in the idea of a representative and vibrant multiracial democracy in a country that has been most abusive to them, that helped me to understand that I need to know more, right? And I need to know that my struggles are connected to Black struggles and that anti-Blackness does exist in our community because what we don't teach our kids about racism, right? And so when we haven't learned about each other, what do you think is going to result, right? The result is anti-Blackness, anti-Asian, and all of those things. And people can't believe that that happens. And I go, well, if you've never learned about each other and we are only learning what the system teaches us, then there's a lot of ignorance there, right? I really have been very bothered by the portrayal of, I think, this moment of increasing anti-Asian violence being seen as individual acts instead of a systemic responsibility, but also the reality that some of our communities members feel a comfort in continuing to say the solution is policing, because that really means that we haven't thought through a lot about what the relationship is to other communities of color in terms of policing, and that policing is not what's going to keep us safe. More community building and more addressing more systemic issues is actually really important. Anti-racist issues and things, policies is going to be more helpful to us. So, I don't have a magic wand, but it's just really important for us to keep understanding that the problems of racism are not, they may be acted out in interpersonal ways, but it's still a system. And it's really important for Asian Americans to understand how anti-Blackness lives and shows up in our communities, and then how we are part of figuring out how to be anti-racist ourselves. Right?
Yeah, I imagine that you're going to continue this work in some way.
Yes.
I think I may have seen
Yes.
what you're going to do on LinkedIn, but what are you going to do next?
Well, first, I'm going to just take a little bit of time to pause. And I really have just been going nonstop for almost this 10 decades, but in particular in the last 2 years, I think, Chanda, you know that I lost both my parents, and I literally haven't even really fully processed what it means to be without them, right? Because the work has kept you so busy, or kept me so busy. And I think for folks like you and I who care so much about what's happening in the communities, you could keep going and working and working and working on these issues, right? But I'm also recognizing that it's important to pause and give myself a break, and that is needed. And so I will do that. But I'm also just lending support to different efforts, in particular in philanthropy and social justice movement building, that I feel like I can help. And so, I don't have a clear plan of, but as you said, I am not gone. I'm very much present.
You don't need a clear plan. That's been evident. You just have a good vision and a vocation, and you know where you can be impactful. And, you've done that over and over again. And I also want to congratulate you on becoming a regent at the University of Minnesota. I know that was a bittersweet moment for you, but congratulations. We are super thrilled that you are there.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'm learning a lot, is all I can say. So, yeah.
Those are the best spaces, though, where you can walk in and learn a lot and, add value. I know I've been in some spaces and I'm like, I think I can be valuable here. I certainly am learning a lot. I'm certainly getting a lot. And then pretty soon I'm like, I figured out where my value add can be.
Right.
If you had any, your best advice that you'd like to share that is really sort of maybe helps you even get through these last couple of years, what would you have to offer?
It's what a lot of the lessons that my mother taught me, right? This is a woman who's never gone to school and who has really lived through so much before she passed. And when we came to this country, I always say by the time I was in second grade, I already spoke more English than my parents. So I became kind of their navigator because I happened to kind of talk and did a lot of things. And by the time I was in high school, my parents had freely offered all of my services to read the paper or read mail for everybody who wanted to. And so I came home one day from school and there were several aunties who had brought stacks of mail and that they had kept. And a lot of it was just junk mail. But they needed someone to review them. And I often helped them to complete paperwork for their public benefits because you had to complete a whole thing to verify that you indeed were job searching and all of these things to get public benefits. So I knew that was kind of the routine. But on this particular day, I was just really upset because I came home as a teenager and here were these aunties with stacks of paper. And so I kind of blew up at my mom and said, I don't understand. They have kids. Why can't their kids do it? Why do you tell people that they can come to me, right? Because I want to just be a teenager. And so my mom just let me rant. And then after my aunties left, she came in my room and gave me that very stern look. And she says, don't ever do that again. You are so lucky that you grew up in this time that we came to this country and you got education and that you have a skill that people need. Right? If you don't have a skill that people need, you can rest assured that nobody's going to be here. Right? They're not going to come to you. Yeah. And so she said, as long as you are alive, you remember that if you have some skill that is helpful to communities, that's what you do. Right. And so that lesson has always kind of stuck with me. And there are hard days, but I try to really think about, I don't know everything. I know some things. I know how to do some things. And if I can help, make things better for community, and if I'm able to be useful, then that is good enough for the moment. And many of the things that I'm working on, I don't have to see the end result, right? Because in fact, many of them might not even happen in my lifetime. So I just have to make sure that I'm contributing to making progress.
Man, what a great story. And, bless our mothers and your father and the lesson and the expectation that they put on us for how we show up in our community. There are days.
Yes.
But certainly they raised us to know that it's not about us.
Yes. That's for sure.
My mom would be like, I don't know who told you it was about you, but it's not. So I think about that a lot and just smile. Yeah. And she's so right. And I was so privileged. And And I know you were. And I know in this moment of lots of transitions, I wish you lots of peace and clarity.
Thank you.
During this leg.
Well, I appreciate it. And I am so really fortunate, Chanda, that we've had many spaces to be together. And you know that I really am supportive of you, but also admire your leadership. And I know we'll be in touch. So,
For sure. Thank you both so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
And that's Bo Thao-Urabe and our host, Chanda Smith Baker. To connect with Bo, add Bo on Twitter at BOTHAO or Instagram at Bo Thao-Urabe. And that's Bo Thao-Urabe. If you love what you hear, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. Thank you to Sarah Gilland, John Coco, and Darlene Benjamin. This is Sue Pak-Kienitz from the Minneapolis Foundation. Thanks for listening.